Now, any account of the Revolution has to begin in 1760 when the great debts amassed during the French and Indian War drove the British government to revamp its colonial policy. New England was the first and the hardest hit region. Its economy was built largely on commerce with the West Indies, and the new tighter regulation on trade with non-English Caribbean islands threatened not only large shipping magnates like John Hancock, but local dock workers, sailors, lumberjacks, shipbuilders, and distillers whose livelihood depended on the traditional smuggling operations of the triangular trade. But within a year, the middle colonies of New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, as well as the southern colonies, had begun to feel the sting of the mother country's determination to raise much-needed revenues from them. By the time the Stamp Act came, a direct tax on the colonists, it was clear that Britain's long-standing policy of salutary or helpful neglect was over, and revenue raising was the new order of the day. Now, the Stamp Act led to a flurry of petitions from colonial legislatures, brilliant oratory on the part of the men in those legislatures, to appeals from colonial agents in London, and to some pretty incendiary oratory from men from Boston to Virginia. But here's the truth. British legislators and bureaucrats were completely unmoved by either rhetorical threats or legal complaints. The truth was, the demands of the British Treasury weighed more heavily on their minds than the grumblings of these unhappy provincial politicians. Something did move Parliament, however, and that was the threat to economic stability of what today we'd call the private sector. Irate British textile manufacturers, anxious luxury good producers, not a few of them members of Parliament, responded quickly and firmly to the precipitous decline in sales and profits when Americans signed and enforced non-consumption and non-importation agreements that boycotted English manufactured goods until the hated laws were repealed. It was this boycott of British manufactured goods that brought the English government to its knees, not once, but several times, and forced it to repeal acts that it had passed. Now, it may have been men who proposed these boycotts, but it was their wives who determined their effectiveness. They were, after all, the consumers and purchasers of cloth and tea. When the call went out to shun both British textiles and teas, and the merchants who dared to continue to sell them, women's buying habits became immediately politicized, and they became active participants in a very unfamiliar political sphere. Colonial women proved more than ready for the challenges of this new role. Newspapers carried accounts of New England women who picketed the shops of merchants who refused to honor the boycott. In fact, the Massachusetts Spy published a little article that said, "The women marched in martial array, far better than our militia has ever done." They ran stories of spinning bees at which women and girls gathered to produce homespun that would replace British-made cloth. I have to make a little aside here. Spinning was the single most boring activity women had to engage in. They hated it. They used to write letters to one another. "I'm pregnant, I hope it's a daughter because I can pass spinning on to her." I tell my students that the only thing more boring than spinning is watching bass fishing on ESPN. So as soon as British cloth was available, women stopped spinning. So it was a great sacrifice to begin to produce homespun. Sometimes these spinning bees drew 100 or more women who were, as Mary Beth Norton has put it, engaged in ideological showcases of colonial resistance to British policy. Every colonial matron and her daughters understood the sacrifice involved in these boycotts, and they were ready to make that sacrifice. Spinning wheels were brought down from the attics and dusted off, and they produced the rough fabric that came to be called Liberty cloth. Women understood the political import of their work. Clothes of your own make and spinning became a badge of honor and a visible political statement as overnight housewives became, in their own words, daughters of liberty. I would argue with you that it's no exaggeration that the single most radical impact of the American Revolution was the instantaneous politicization of women.